Hey guys, I'm Brendan, and I am the owner of the Healthy Cow blog at thehealthycow.blogspot.com. And today I've got a presentation for you entitled How the Government's Nutrition Advice is Making Us Fat and Sick. And I want to make the argument that the USDA dietary guidelines are a mismatch with our evolutionary history and are in fact making us fat and sick. So, I'm an independent researcher and blogger, which means I'm a huge dork, and I spend a lot of my free time researching nutrition and writing about it on my blog, The Healthy Cow. And I'm a student at UConn right now. I'm studying dietetics. I graduate this summer, at which point I will take the registered dietitian exam and become an RD. And next fall I'll start graduate school and start the road to becoming a professor of nutrition. So let's do the dang thing. Evolution is the backbone of biology. A famous guy once said, "Nothing makes sense in biology except in the light of evolution." I forget the guy's name. It's some Russian guy. I can't even pronounce his name, but that's not important. The point is, nutrition is a subfield of biology, so it only makes sense that we would want to use evolution to guide us in nutrition, right? Except for the fact that we don't. And it makes research really difficult because you have nothing to fall back on. You're sort of just shooting in the dark. So the point is, if we're going to understand the present, we have to understand the past. And we have 2.5 million years of human history to look at. Successful evolution to look at and see what we should be eating. Now, just a quick synopsis here of human history. We've been around for 2.5 million years. Agriculture was just discovered in the past 10,000 years. That means for over 99% of human history, we were hunter-gatherers. What this means is that we were running around hunting, killing big game, finding wild vegetables and tubers and fruits. When we adopted agriculture, we started growing our own food, and we switched over to a more grain-based diet, like bread, rice, that kind of stuff, which we didn't have available to us until that point. Just to put it in context, in a visual context, to show you the history of hunter-gathering and agriculture, if you imagine that our human history is a football field, so 100 yards. And on the next slide I'm gonna split it up into the blue section is going to be our time as hunter-gatherers, cavemen, whatever you want to call it, and the red is going to be our time as agriculturists and farmers. Okay, so it's not quite blue, it's more of a purple, violet-ish, but you can tell there's not much farming going on there. In fact, you probably can't even see the red. That's why I made that handy little arrow there to point to the red. Here, let me zoom in for you. There you can see a little bit better there. It's just a fraction of a yard. So it's pretty clear looking at the football field analogy that we haven't been farming for very long. We've been hunting and gathering for the vast majority of our human history, eating meat, vegetables, and I'll get more into the specifics later, but you can clearly see that we haven't been farming for very long. We did have good reason to start farming, though. As you probably already know, agriculture allows us to support more people, and the goal of any species is to reproduce and expand the population. I don't think we had a choice, really. I mean, we weren't just going to stop having sex. I mean, that's just crazy. They would have been out of their minds. But the story you've most likely heard about hunter and gatherers is a myth. Here are a few common assumptions. They lived a short, brutish life, that they died young and they had brutal existence, that they had no free time. Since they couldn't grow their own food, they must have had to spend all day hunting and gathering, and that the change to farming improved their quality of life. They all make sense on the surface, but as you'll see, they're just not true. So in reality, the picture's a little different. Early farmers, after agriculture began, had less free time than hunter-gatherers did. They actually had more disease, tooth decay, malnutrition, infectious disease, etc. Actually, one of the ways that they tell which era a skeleton comes from is based on the health of the bones and the teeth. reduction in height. Men lost 6 inches after agriculture. Women lost 5 inches. They were down to 5 feet even. It's almost a midget. Reduced life expectancy from 26 to 19. That's pretty significant. 19 years old, the average lifespan. And lastly, now that we could control our food supply and grow our own food, it gave us the ability to have power over other people, because now they're dependent on you to feed them. Whereas before they could just go out into the wilderness and hunt for themselves if they wanted to. So now we have kings and slaves. So clearly, whereas the kings may have a better lifestyle now after agriculture, the slaves definitely don't. They're out there in the fields all day, slaving, literally. One of the best ways to get some insight into the health of hunter-gatherers is to study modern hunter-gatherers. And a study in 2007 showed that the average modal age of death is 72 years. Now, modal, what that means is that more people died at 72 years of age than any other age. So it's not the same as the average, which would take into account infant deaths, and that kind of skews the number a little lower than it would be. So 72 is the average modal age of death. In the United States, it's 77.9. And that's pretty close, considering that they don't have any modern medicine keeping them alive. And on top of all that, genetically, we're still hunter-gatherers. For the most part, we're just about the same as we were 10,000 years ago. Now, granted, there's been some evolution since the Paleolithic era. For example, a lot of us have developed the ability to digest cow's milk into adulthood, whereas most species, and us, before a certain point, lost the ability to digest lactose in milk after infancy, after we would have been weaned from our mothers. But today, a large portion of us can consume milk. But while there's been some adaptation to the newer foods that we've introduced to our species, the truth is that we're best adapted to a hunter-gatherer type diet. There hasn't been enough time or selection pressure to completely adapt to modern foods. So here's some examples of what hunter-gatherer societies would have eaten. And it varied depending on the climate. You know, if they were in a colder climate, they would have eaten a lot more fish, a lot more animals, and less vegetables, since they weren't going to be growing all year round. If they were in Africa, like we were for a lot of our human history, they would have eaten a more varied diet with more fruit, starchy tubers, even bugs, believe it or not. A good source of omega-3s. You don't have to eat bugs, though, if you want to eat like our ancestors. This is more of a modern update to what they were eating back then. Here you can see some salmon. That's wild salmon. There's some greens, some potatoes, fruit, coconut, and eggs. The truth is, we can't eat like our hunter-gatherers ancestors did. The best we can do is eat like them, and these are the foods that we can use to best do that. Now, you may have heard of a diet called the paleo diet, and what this is basically what I'm talking about. It's a way to emulate what our ancestors ate with modern foods that we have today. It's based on meat and vegetables, and it can vary depending on what you're eating, and you don't have to eat more fat, but for the most part, the paleo diet does have more fat, has fewer carbohydrates, it's higher in cholesterol, and there's little to no grains or dairy. Now I know what you're thinking, because every time I tell someone they should eat more fat and cholesterol, they think I'm trying to kill them, and you might as well just stab me in the heart with a knife. But seriously, this is how our ancestors ate. This is how we're best evolutionarily adapted to be eating. We're designed to be eating meat, seafood, vegetables, potatoes, fruit, eggs, nuts, coconut. Real natural food. These are the foods that work best for everyone based on our history. Can some people eat grains and dairy and vegetable oils and do fine and not get fat and not die of heart disease? Yeah, some people can. But many of us cannot. And it might not always manifest itself as heart disease or cancer or chronic disease like that. It might end up as rheumatoid arthritis. It might be migraines. It might be IBS. The symptoms can vary. And if you find yourself suffering from any of these diseases, I would love to see you try the paleo diet and see how you react to it. It might just fix your nagging problems that you've been struggling with for years. But what I want you to understand about these diseases is that it's not normal. It may be common. It's common today to have migraines and IBS. It's not normal. It's not how we are supposed to be as human beings. And it happens when we have a mismatch between what we're eating and what we're designed to eat. And so I hope that all makes sense. And now that you know what kind of foods we're designed to be eating, meat, seafood, vegetables, potatoes, etc., I want to show you what the government tells us we should be eating. What the hell is that? Now I know this is outdated. This is from the 90s, I believe, back when I was a kid. But this is the food pyramid, and it hasn't changed much. This is just the most dramatic example. You can see the base of the pyramid, the base of your diet, the government says, should be grains. Bread, cereal, rice, and pasta. Now, although the pyramid didn't exist until the 90s, I believe, the dietary guidelines started in 1977. And apparently this was the first time the government ever gave nutrition advice, and apparently they felt like they needed to tell us what to eat. Whether or not that's based in science or politics, you'll see. But here are some of the more specific recommendations that they made. This is how they thought we should change our diet. They said to eat less saturated fat and cholesterol, like eggs, red meat, butter, full-fat dairy, which doesn't make any freaking sense because we've been eating these foods for 2.5 million years and heart disease was never an issue. But hey, who am I to judge the government? They wanted us to eat more grains, vegetable oils, chicken, fish, low-fat dairy, fruits, and vegetables. Now, some of those are fine. Fruits and vegetables are great. The fish is great. But the grains and the vegetable oils and the low-fat dairy, the skim milk, the chicken, even the chicken, we've been eating red meat for the most part of our history. We haven't eaten chicken, really. Now, does this sound like the way he would have eaten? This isn't even the way my grandma would have grown up eating. Now, this isn't my grandma. This is just a random old lady I found on the internet. But you get the point. I mean, even people of that generation wouldn't have eaten low-fat foods. They would have eaten butter and lard. They didn't eat vegetable oil. They didn't really eat skim milk. Skim milk was fed to pigs to make them fat before it was a health food. Just a little nugget there. So clearly the government was asking us to eat in a way that we had never before in history eaten. So it's not difficult to imagine that there was a lot of scientific debate over nutrition at the time, and the science didn't really didn't support the advice that the government was giving out. In fact, George McGovern, who was the senator in charge of the select committee that made the dietary guidelines in 1977, did it for political reasons. His Senate Select Committee was at risk of being demoted to a subcommittee, so he felt like that they had to make some decision on nutrition and say something. According to the committee's staff director from his committee, and I quote, "We were totally naive, a bunch of kids who just thought, hell, we should say something on this subject before we go bankrupt." Doesn't sound too confident to me. Now, I'm not going to really get into the details of the science that was available at the time. I'm not going to go into that too much. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the graphs that show what we've been eating since the 70s till today. And then we'll see what that's done to our health. But before I bust out these graphs, I just want to remind you, this is what the government wanted us to do. Less saturated fat and cholesterol, fewer eggs, red meat, butter, full-fat dairy, and more grains, more vegetable oils, more chicken, fish, low-fat dairy, and fruits and vegetables. Okay, so the first one is eggs, and you can clearly see that our total egg consumption has gone down since 1970, and I suspect that it might have gone down even more because this doesn't even account for all the people that throw away the yolks and just eat the whites. This is just the food disappearance data, which only takes into account what is purchased. So it's probably even more of a decline than this as far as the yolks are concerned, and that's where all the cholesterol and the fat is. So eggs, definitely down. Here we see meat consumption. The total meat consumption has gone up just a little bit, but red meat consumption has actually gone down since 1970. while chicken has gone up dramatically. So we replaced a higher fat meat, red meat, with a lower fat meat, poultry, just like they wanted us to. Fish is about the same, hasn't really budged. Here's the milk consumption, and you can see, just like they wanted us to, whole milk dropped considerably, hugely, down from about 25 gallons per capita down to what looks like about 7. Huge difference. While 2% low-fat milk and fat-free have been on the rise. And last but not least, here you can see the flour and grain consumption has gone up since 1970 pretty considerably. So we've pretty much followed all of their advice. We've eaten fewer eggs, less whole full-fat dairy. We've eaten less red meat, more chicken. We've increased our flour and grain consumption. And I know I don't have a graph about the vegetable oils, but considering vegetable oils weren't even a food 100 years ago, it's pretty safe to assume that they've gone up in consumption considerably. So let's just see in these few graphs I'm going to show you how eating how the government wanted us to eat has affected our waistline. Boom! We went from blue to red. That's how bad it is. No, but seriously, if you look at that first graph from 85, a lot of the states, the white ones are, that means the data was missing. We didn't have any of the obesity data, but the other ones you can see, the light blue means that less than 10% of the population was obese. And the darker blue meant that 10 to 14% of the population was obese. So the worst state, let's just take South Carolina, for example, had 10 to 14% obesity in 1985. Fast forward to 2010, South Carolina has over 30% obesity. That's more than double, almost triple the rates of obesity in just 25 years. That is ridiculous. And it's not because we're eating the wrong foods according to the government. We're eating exactly the ones that they want us to eat. So obesity sets us up to be at a higher risk of dying prematurely from heart disease, cancer, diabetes. It'll ruin our quality of life. Not to mention it'll make us have to pay for 2 seats on an airplane. Nobody wants to deal with that. So we're pretty clearly less healthy today than we have been even 25 years ago. And as I would argue, it's because what we're eating today, grains, vegetable oils, all that, the grains are the base of our diet. That is completely a mismatch with how we evolved as human beings. But enough of that archaeological, evolutionary, biology, mumbo-jumbo. For the last few minutes here, I'm going to just finish off and talk about modern science and what it says about grains, saturated fat, and cholesterol. 3 of the main topics, the main differences between the way our ancestors ate and how we're eating today. So, what's wrong with grains? I don't even know where to begin with this. There's so much to talk about. To begin with, they're low in vitamins and minerals. I know you've probably heard in the media or from a dietitian that whole grains are nutrient-dense foods. Well, they're definitely not. And I'll show you a graph in a minute actually to show that. They're difficult to digest and they may cause gut irritation. This is mostly concerned with gluten, which is a protein in wheat you may have heard of. It can be very problematic for some people, causing IBS, or any number of digestive issues, really. Third, they deplete your mineral status. This pertains to whole grains specifically. It's been proven that people who eat a lot of whole grains have a worse calcium, magnesium, and zinc status. I know it's probably hard to believe based on what everyone tells you about whole grains, but in this case, refined grains are actually better for you, as far as mineral status goes. And lastly, they just displace more nutritious foods from the diet. I mean, if you're basing your diet on grains, then you're going to be probably missing out on enough meat or vegetables or fruit or nuts or any number of other foods that you could be getting that have more nutrients in them. Okay, so here's the graph that I was talking about, and this comes straight out of my blog post, Why You Don't Need Grains. Now, I created this graph on Excel. What I did was I looked up the nutrient information for 2 whole grains, so whole wheat bread and brown rice, and I averaged the nutrient content. And I expressed it in this graph in terms of the RDA, which is how much you need of each nutrient per day. And you can see in the blue there, that's the average for the whole wheat bread and the brown rice. Versus the red, which I took 100 grams of beef tenderloin and 100 grams of pork, and I averaged those together. And I expressed that in the same way in terms of the RDA. So here you can see a pretty clear comparison between whole grains and meat. And I think it's pretty clear that red meat kicks the shit out of grains. It isn't even close. I actually created this graph and I wrote this blog post because one of my professors was concerned about a classmate not eating any grains. She said, "Oh, how are you going to get your B vitamins?" How are you going to get your B vitamins? From meat, obviously. Look at this. This is ridiculous. Far more B vitamins in meat. The fact that someone who has a PhD in nutrition can make that statement is absolutely ridiculous. So you're going to have no problem getting your vitamins without grains. I mean, there's nothing in them, really. Granted, there's some iron, zinc, magnesium, some of the minerals, they are in the grains, but you don't absorb them because there's a lot of anti-nutrients that bind to them, and it doesn't matter if they're there or not. They're not going to end up in your body. They're just going to be pooped right out. So that's it for grains. You know, if you want to eat them, eat them. Just understand that what you're eating is not a healthy food. It's basically just empty calories. You're not supporting health in any way. So, you know, I know they're a major part of society, so if you're gonna have a sandwich, if you're gonna have a bowl of rice, do it. Just understand what you're doing. Alright, on to saturated fat. Alright, saturated fat, my favorite topic. Does it really raise our cholesterol? But that's what you'll hear from the government and from the popular media. Does it really increase our risk of heart disease? Well, early studies decades ago showed that in the short term, in just a few weeks, eating saturated fat increases your total cholesterol. Who gives a shit? In the long term, studies show that people who eat more saturated fat have the same cholesterol level as people who eat less saturated fat. And does it even matter? So the question is not does saturated fat increase our cholesterol, but does it really increase our risk for heart disease? That's what we're ultimately after here. And the answer is clearly no. And here's some research to back that up. Now here are two of my favorite studies, which I've used on my blog extensively. It's a pair of meta-analyses. A meta-analysis is basically a study of studies. So it takes the existing research that was already done, and it puts all the data together to try to find a bigger picture. So you can see this has over 300,000 subjects in the first one here, and I quote, "Intake of saturated fat was not associated with an increased risk of coronary heart disease, stroke, or cardiovascular disease." So this is long term, and we're not measuring cholesterol here, we're measuring coronary heart disease, which is that's the outcome we really want, not cholesterol. And it's been shown that there's no association with saturated fat and heart disease. And there's another one there in 2010, same year, over about 1.5 million subjects came out with the same result. There is no connection between saturated fat intake and heart disease. How many times do I have to say it? This is not going to be the last. But have no fear, I have more here. This graph is the first of two. This comes from Malcolm Kendrick's book, The Great Cholesterol Con, The Truth About What Really Causes Heart Disease and How to Avoid It. What he did was he took the countries in Europe, the 7 countries in Europe that eat the least saturated fat, and he compared that with their rates of heart disease. So these are the countries with the least saturated fat intake. You see Georgia, I can't even pronounce half of these, but they have very low saturated fat intake. It's down below 7.5%. Which actually is what the dietary guidelines recommend if you want to have good heart health. Incidentally, their death rate from heart disease is pretty high. Let's just look at Georgia as an example. They have about 6%-ish, 5%-ish saturated fat consumption. Yet their deaths from heart disease are about 500 per 100,000 people. Now, take a snapshot of this in your mind, and I'm going to go over to the next graph, which is the 7 countries that eat the most saturated fat in Europe. Now, you see immediately how much more saturated fat these countries eat. All of them are over 12.5% of their calories. Let's just take Iceland, for example. It looks like Iceland eats about 14% of their calories from saturated fat. Their heart disease rates down around 200 as compared to the other one in the last graph, which was about 500. Now, look, all these countries eat more saturated fat than the American government is telling us to eat, far more saturated fat. They say we should have it below 10% and below 7% if we have any high risk of heart disease. Listen, no one's telling France to reduce their saturated fat content. They have some of the lowest rates of heart disease in the world. Now here's just for your benefit so you can see a little more clearly. Georgia, one of the countries with the least saturated fat consumption, eats around 5% of their calories from saturated fat, and they have a much higher rate of heart disease than Iceland, who eats a lot more saturated fat. Now, yeah, understand that this is all observational. None of this really proves anything. There's a lot of factors here that are not being accounted for. But it's pretty damn interesting that every single one of the countries that eats the most saturated fat has a lower rate of heart disease than every single one of the countries that eats the least saturated fat. It doesn't really make any sense if you listen to the government's advice. And that's a great reason why you should not listen to the government's advice on nutrition. Alright, I've gone on long enough on this topic. This is what I want you to come away with this presentation with. I want you to think about nutrition from an ancestral perspective, which is something that's clearly lacking in the minds of the people in nutrition these days. We are designed to eat a certain way. That doesn't mean that we can't introduce new foods and they might be healthy for us. It just means that the foods that are best for us are the ones that we've been eating for millions of years. Start with that. Try it out for 30 days. Try the paleo diet. If you want after that, if you want to introduce more grains and try having rice, if you feel fine, then do it. Look, we are partially adapted to the newer foods like grains and dairy and probably not vegetable oils. Those are very, very new. But some of us may do fine on those foods. A lot of us don't. See what works for you. Everyone's different. Next, don't listen to what the government tells you should be eating. They have ulterior motives. They have to keep every industry satisfied. Can you imagine if they decided to forego grains and tell everyone that they should eat a paleo diet? What about what's going to happen to all of those industries that are growing wheat and corn and rice? They would go out of business. There would be no more grain industry. It would ruin lives. The government cannot be responsible for that. Not to mention that the grain industry is probably feeding them money to keep them alive. So then politicians are not going to want to do that either. Okay, minimize your grains. And I say that because I know it's not really feasible for a lot of people to eliminate grains. And I don't think everyone needs to eliminate grains. But you need to understand that what you're eating is a low nutrient food. And it does not support health. And lastly, don't be afraid of fat and cholesterol, especially from sources that we've been eating for 2.5 million years, like red meat and bacon. Who doesn't love bacon? Yes, I'm telling you to eat bacon. Go out and have an eggs and bacon breakfast for dinner. I do it all the time. So that's it, guys. I hope you enjoyed that. That was my first attempt at making a video by talking into my computer for a half an hour. Hopefully it wasn't too boring. Read my blog, The Healthy Cow, smiley face, thehealthycow.blogspot.com, and like me on Facebook. Adios.